Okay, so get ready because we are diving headfirst into the Cold War.
Definitely a deep dive.
You got that right.
And you've given us a ton of sources for this one.
Yeah.
It's going to be a long one.
It really highlights how this thing, it wasn't just some regional conflict, you know?
Yeah,
This
right.
was a global standoff with sky-high stakes
Absolutely.
that shaped the entire world for decades.
Yeah. And it's funny because people think, oh, the Cold War, we learned about that in history class.
Right.
But it's way more relevant than a lot of people realize.
It is.
It really is.
So to really wrap our heads around it, like, imagine this. It's the end of World War II, right? You'd think everyone would be, like, popping champagne, throwing confetti.
Victory parades.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But instead, it's like this weird family reunion where everybody's kind of eyeing each other suspiciously over the potato salad.
Yeah. It's a really good way to put it.
Like, nobody really trusts what's on their plate.
The end of World War II, while a victory brought about a lot of anxieties that kind of planted the seeds for the Cold War.
And at the heart of this awkward family reunion, you've got the U.S. and the Soviet Union, right? Two superpowers, fresh off a win, but with totally different ideas about how to run the world.
Totally. And, it's not even just different ideas. It's like fundamentally opposed worldviews.
Oh, yeah.
The U.S. championing capitalist democracy.
Right.
The Soviet Union pushing for a communist system.
Yeah, and each side was convinced that the other one was an existential threat.
Exactly.
Like they weren't just playing political games. This was about survival.
It really was. And the sources you shared, they really highlight that sense of mistrust.
Yeah.
That deep ideological divide.
Okay, but then add this to the mix. Germany, which was, kind of a big deal in World War II,
It was a big deal.
is now defeated and divided,
Right.
leaving this massive power vacuum right in the middle of Europe.
Huge vacuum.
And guess who wants to fill it?
Well, both of them,
Both of them.
of course.
The U.S. and the Soviet Union are both like, that's my seat.
Exactly. And your sources point to this as a major catalyst for the Cold War.
Oh, totally. This scramble to fill the void left by Germany just amps up the suspicion and animosity between these two superpowers.
Oh, absolutely.
And that brings us to some of those moments where the Cold War went from simmering to like a full-on boil.
Yeah.
And Berlin, this divided city, becomes like the poster child for this whole conflict.
Right in the heart of it all.
Yeah, right there in the heart of it.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the Berlin Blockade in 1948.
Okay.
Picture this. The Soviet Union decides to completely cut off West Berlin.
Wow.
No food.
Oh, my gosh.
No supply. Basically holding the entire city hostage.
Talk about a power move.
Right. Like, can you imagine the audacity?
It's incredible.
But here's the thing. The West, they weren't going to back down.
No, they were not.
They were not going to let West Berlin just wither on the vine.
They were not.
So what do? They launched the Berlin airlift.
An incredible feat of logistics.
Unbelievable.
Determination.
For over a year, they airlifted supplies around the clock.
Around the clock.
Planes landing every few minutes.
I mean, it's amazing when you think about the scale of it.
It's mind-blowing.
Just the amount of coordination and resources.
Food, fuel, medicine, you name it. They flew it in.
They flew it all in.
It was this incredible display of like, we're not going to be bullied. We're going to do what it takes to support our allies.
It was a powerful message for sure.
Right.
And it really solidified the division of Germany and by extension the world into these two opposing blocs.
And as tense as the Berlin blockade was,
Right.
nothing really compares to the Cuban Missile Crisis in terms of like sheer heart-stopping terror.
Yeah, if there's one event that still gives people chills from the Cold War, it's this.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
So for our listener who maybe doesn't remember all the details, we're talking about Soviet missiles in Cuba
90 miles off the coast of Florida.
pointed at the U.S.
That's close.
So close.
Too close.
Way too close for comfort.
Those 13 days in October of '62, they were like a pressure cooker.
I bet.
The whole world was holding its breath.
Yeah.
Wondering if this was it,
Yeah, like was this going to be the moment everything went nuclear?
Exactly. And what's really scary is that it wasn't just a bluff.
Right.
Like, we really were on the brink of nuclear war.
The sources we have, they really drive home how close we came to just total annihilation.
It's a sobering thought, for sure.
It really is.
That the fate of the world could have come down to, like, one wrong move or miscalculation.
And it shows you just how high the stakes were throughout the Cold War.
Absolutely.
It's wild to think about, right? Like, we learned about it in school, but to actually picture it, Those moments where it felt like the world was holding its breath.
Yeah, it's one thing to read about it in a textbook, but it's another thing to really grasp the scale of it,
Totally.
the potential consequences.
And the thing is, it wasn't just about the nukes.
Right.
It was this constant, like, undercurrent of tension.
A global chess match.
Yeah.
With each side trying to outmaneuver the other.
And one of the ways they did that, which really jumped out at me from these sources, was through these proxy wars.
Oh, yeah, the proxy wars.
It's like a whole other level of conflict, right?
Absolutely. Proxy wars were a defining feature of the Cold War. It was a way for the superpowers to fight each other without actually fighting each other.
Okay, so explain that. Like, how does that even work?
Well, it's like this. You've got these smaller conflicts happening around the world, right?
Right.
And each superpower would pick a side.
Yeah.
They'd send weapons, provide funding, train soldiers,
Yeah.
all to support their chosen side.
So it's like they're fighting each other through these other countries?
Exactly. It's
Right.
like they're using these smaller conflicts as battlegrounds for their own ideological struggle.
And it's not just theoretical, right? Like, we see this play out in a big way in the Vietnam War.
Absolutely. The Vietnam War is a perfect example of a proxy war.
Yeah.
You had the communist North, supported by the Soviet Union,
Right.
and the U.S. backed South.
And it became this huge, protracted, bloody conflict.
It did. And it's important to remember that these proxy wars, they weren't just sideshows.
Right.
They had a huge impact on the countries involved.
Oh, absolutely.
The human cost was devastating.
Millions of lives lost.
Economy shattered
And for what?
because of this ideological struggle between two superpowers.
It's really sobering when you think about it.
It is.
But the Cold War wasn't just fought on battlefields.
Yeah.
It was also this, like, competition of ideas,
Absolutely.
technology,
Uh,
even, like, who could go the furthest in space.
the space
The
race,
ultimate Cold War showdown.
in some ways.
Right. Like, on the one hand, you've got the threat of nuclear annihilation.
Yeah.
And on the other, you've got these incredible advancements in science and technology.
It's a strange juxtaposition for sure.
It is.
But it really captures the spirit of the Cold War.
Totally. Like, this constant tension pushing both sides to the absolute limit.
And it all started with Sputnik,
Sputnik.
the first artificial satellite.
Launched by the Soviets in 1957.
Can you imagine what that must have been like?
I can't even.
To see this little metal sphere orbiting the Earth,
A sign that the Soviets were winning the space race.
at least at that moment.
Right.
But it really lit a fire under the U.S.
Yeah, it was like game on.
And that kicked off this incredible period of innovation and discovery,
With the Apollo missions.
the moon landing.
It's amazing to think that all came out of this rivalry.
It's a testament to human ingenuity.
That even in the darkest of times, we can still achieve incredible things.
Absolutely.
But of course, this period of intense Cold War rivalry couldn't last forever.
No, we couldn't.
And things started to shift in the 1980s
Okay.
with the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev
Gorbachev.
in the Soviet Union
Right.
and his attempts to reform the Soviet system.
Perestroika and glasnost.
It was a real turning point
It was.
because for decades, it seemed like the Soviet Union was this, like, impenetrable force, this
Yeah.
unyielding adversary.
And then Gorbachev comes along and he's like, we need to change.
We need to open up,
Exactly. He recognized that the Soviet system was stagnating.
that it couldn't compete with the West.
And he was right.
But his reforms, they had some unintended consequences.
So he did.
Because by loosening control,
Right.
he inadvertently unleashed forces that he couldn't control. Nationalist movements within the Soviet republics,
Economic turmoil.
and of course the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989.
An iconic moment.
It was like the whole world was watching.
Like a giant party had broken out.
People chipping away at the wall, tearing it down with their bare hands.
After decades of separation,
Families reunited.
it was a powerful symbol of hope and freedom.
And it really marked the beginning of the end for the Cold War.
It did.
I mean, can you imagine, like, being there in Berlin and seeing that wall come down with your own eyes?
What a moment, right?
Incredible.
Just this feeling that anything is possible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like the world was taking this collective sigh of relief.
Like we dodged a bullet.
Right.
But it's interesting because the end of the Cold War wasn't some kind of fairy tale ending.
Oh, no.
It was way more complicated than that.
Right, because the Soviet Union itself, it didn't just, like, fade away.
Oh, it did.
It completely unraveled.
Yeah. And that had huge consequences,
Huge.
especially for the former Soviet republics.
Right, because for them, it was like going through this massive breakup.
A really messy divorce.
Right, with all the drama and the uncertainty.
And the fighting over who gets the dacha.
Exactly. And it wasn't just the republics that had to figure things out.
No, Russia itself was in a really tough spot.
Right, they went from being like a global superpower
Top dog.
to suddenly having to redefine themselves.
Their whole identity was in flux.
Their economy was a mess.
And they had to figure out their place in this new world order.
It must have been a really disorienting time.
Oh, absolutely. And, while the Soviet Union was going through all of this,
Yeah.
the U.S. was kind of like the last one standing.
Right, like the winner by default.
But even that came with its own set of challenges.
Of course it did.
Because suddenly the U.S. was the sole superpower.
Top dog?
Exactly. And they had to figure out how to navigate this new world order.
Without their old rival to define them.
Exactly. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, we won the Cold War, now what?
Right, and it seems like some of those questions, they're still relevant today.
Oh, absolutely.
Because when you look at what's happening in the world now
Yeah.
with the rise of China, the war in Ukraine,
Yeah.
the increasing tension between global powers.
It feels like we're kind of moving back in that direction, doesn't it?
It really does. Like we've learned the steps to this dangerous dance and we're starting to see them again.
Maybe with a slightly different tempo,
Right, the new remix.
but a familiar tune.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Cold War, what are some of the key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think the biggest one is that history, it has a way of rhyming.
I like that.
The past, it doesn't just disappear. It shapes the present and the future.
It's like those echoes we were talking about.
Exactly. And the Cold War, it might be over, but its legacy, it's still with us.
In so many ways.
It reminds us that even when things seem really dark and hopeless,
There's always a chance for things to change.
for better or for worse.
True. So to our listeners out there, if you're fascinated by this era, like we are,
And you should be.
this is just the tip of the iceberg.
There's a whole world of information out there.
Books, documentaries, archives.
You name it.
So keep digging, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep asking questions.
Because the more we understand the past
The better equipped we are to navigate the present.
and the future.
And on that note, that's a wrap on another deep dive.
Until next time.